Night shrouded the city in a thick shroud of darkness. The streets, usually full of life, looked deserted, as if the houses themselves were afraid to leave the light in their windows. The rumble of cars could be heard in the distance, but there was no one on this street, just her. A girl in a wheelchair rolled leisurely along the sidewalk. The wheels of her wheelchair, making a barely audible squeak, became the only sound in this oppressive silence. The bag slung over the back of the wheelchair swayed slightly in time with the movement. She didn't look around. She knew all too well that this neighborhood was rarely hospitable at night. The sound of the engine breaking the silence made her flinch. The patrol car drove slowly behind her, like a predator stalking its prey. Her heart pounded harder, but she kept moving forward, trying not to turn around. Her prayers for the car to just pass by went unheard. The flashing beacon blinked, and a voice on the loudspeaker, soaked with indifference, made her stop. "Wait a minute. Where are you going so late?" came a policeman's voice. She froze, feeling the lump in her throat. The policeman stepped out of the car, slamming the door so that the sound echoed off the walls. The man was tall, with cold eyes and lips that played with an unpleasant half-smile, and he walked leisurely toward her. His gestures radiated the confidence of a man accustomed to feeling superior. "What do we have here?" He stretched out, looking at the girl as if she were an object in a shop window. "It's a little late for a walk, isn't it?" "I'm just going home." Her voice was quieter than she'd expected. It was a mixture of fear and restrained anger. "Home, huh?" The policeman leaned against the car and folded his arms across his chest. "Maybe you're up to something. There's been a few burglaries around here lately. You're not the kind of guy who thinks the laws don't apply to you, are you?" She clenched her hands on the armrests of the wheelchair, trying not to let out a shiver. The policeman leaned over, looking into her eyes, and something unkind flashed in his gaze. "Well, let's see who you are." He stepped closer, and his shadow covered her face. The girl felt a stiffening fear creeping into every cell of her body. She didn't know that this moment would be the beginning of something more than a simple stop on a dark street. She could only hope that she had the strength to endure what would follow. The policeman took a step back, crossing his arms over his chest. His eyes narrowed, studying the girl as if she were his prey. The cold stare sent chills down her spine. "I wonder," he began, his voice soaked with venom, "why you're out here alone, so late. It's a rough neighborhood, don't you think? Or do you grace it with your presence?" She felt the heat rising to her cheeks, but she forced herself to keep quiet. An answer was inappropriate. It would only make things worse. The man seemed to enjoy her silence. His half-smile grew wider, his tone even more mocking. "Or are you waiting for someone?" he continued, leaning closer to her. "People like you usually have their own connections. Maybe I should check what's in your bag." The girl gripped the straps of the wheelchair tighter, trying to hold back a shiver. "There's nothing in my bag," she said, trying to make her voice firm. But her words, like a stone dropped into an empty barrel, caused only an echo of derision. "Oh, I wouldn't be so sure," he said, straightening up. "You realize that we police officers often have to deal with—" He paused, as if savoring the word, "suspicious individuals." She looked up, but immediately regretted it. His face contorted with triumphant pleasure, as if he'd caught her doing something forbidden. "What? Did it hurt?" He slowly stepped even closer, his shadow covering her face completely. "Maybe you should learn to respect those who uphold the law." "I didn't do anything," she squeezed out, her voice trailing off into a whisper. "Nothing?" He straightened sharply, as if laughing at her words. "We'll see about that." He abruptly grabbed her bag from her wheelchair. She tried to object, but his look was too intimidating. The policeman started rummaging through her things, throwing them on the ground. "You see?" he said with a grin, shaking the last of the items out of the bag. "Look at this. Nothing interesting. That's a shame. But you know, it makes me wonder. What if you're hiding something?" She felt the tension in the air become unbearable. Her heart was beating so loudly that it seemed to drown out the man's words. The policeman straightened, examining her from head to toe. "You know, people like you always have secrets," he hissed, leaning toward her, "and I'm going to reveal them." Those words hung in the air like the herald of a storm. She realized that whatever happened next would be far worse than what had happened before. Let's pause for a moment. Write in the comments where you're listening to our stories from and whether you have faced similar situations in your life. We're interested in your opinions and experiences. If you haven't subscribed yet, do it now so you don't miss the next stories. As we continue. The policeman threw the empty bag on the ground like unnecessary junk. His eyes glistened with pleasure, as if he was enjoying every second of what was happening. The girl sat motionless, her fingers gripping the armrests of the wheelchair so hard that her knuckles turned white. She knew that any word, any movement could only aggravate her situation. "You're not saying anything, are you?" he said, leaning toward her slowly. "As always, people like you have nothing to say. You just sit there, waiting for others to do it for you." His voice was filled with contempt, each word a blow. She tried to turn away, but he straightened abruptly and walked around her wheelchair, stopping behind her. "I wonder what it's like to live like this," he continued, speaking loudly so that his words echoed in the silence of the street. "Without the ability to walk, to work, to be useful. Just a burden on society, isn't it?" His footsteps slowed, and he stopped beside the car. She heard the door open, then a metallic sound, as if he were pulling something out of the glove compartment. Panic flashed through her mind. She didn't dare look back, but her heart sank when she heard the sound of an object sliding across the glass. "You know, I have something for you here." His voice cut through the silence again. He stepped closer, holding a bottle of beer in his hand. There was something predatory, almost sadistic in his gaze. She met his eyes for a moment, and that moment was enough to know that he would do whatever he wanted, and nothing would stop him. "Let's see if you're useful," he said, stepping close to her. Before she realized what was happening, he had roughly inserted the neck of the bottle into her mouth. Pain and humiliation came over her in a wave. She could taste the glass and the metallic tang of the beer he'd poured inside. She tried to push him away, but her movements were too weak. "What? You don't like it?" he said with a sneer. "That's a lesson to you. Maybe next time you'll think twice before crossing paths with those above you." Tears came to her eyes, but she held herself back. She couldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her broken, yet an abyss of rage and despair was growing inside her. "Well, I think it'll do you good," he added, putting the bottle away and wiping the neck with his uniform shirt. "Maybe you'll finally understand your place in the world." His laughter echoed through the empty street, leaving her alone with a bitter sense of humiliation. He turned, dropping the bottle on the ground, and walked toward the car without looking back. She sat there, unmoving, aware of every second of what had happened. But, in the depths of her eyes, a spark began to form, not of despair, but of a rage that could destroy everything. That moment was a turning point. She didn't know how, but she was sure this man would pay for everything. The thud of the patrol car door slamming shut broke the silence. The policeman sat down behind the wheel and started the engine, but he didn't hurry to leave. He remained standing a few meters away from her, as if enjoying his triumph. The headlights flooded the street, illuminating her face, wet with tears, and the bottle lying on the sidewalk beside her. She tried to gather the strength to do something, to shout, to call for help, but the words stuck in her throat. A light breeze carried the sound of footsteps. Someone was walking by, and for a moment hope flickered in her soul. The man with the headphones on his head glimpsed her, but immediately looked away, retracing his steps. His silhouette vanished into the darkness, leaving her alone with her pain. Soon, a couple appeared on the horizon, a man and a woman who were talking animatedly about something. Their voices grew louder and louder until they noticed the girl. The man slowed down, his gaze lingering on the bottle and the torn bag. The woman tugged at his arm. "Let's go," she said, almost in a whisper. "It's none of our business." "But," he started, looking away, but she was adamant. "There's nothing we can do. Let's just go." Their figures disappeared around the corner, leaving behind a silence that seemed even more deafening. The girl looked around, her gaze resting on the surveillance camera mounted on the corner of the building. A red light was flashing, confirming that every moment had been recorded. Her heart shuddered at the thought that someone might have seen all of this, but hadn't even thought to intervene. A teenager on a bicycle appeared in the distance. He slowed down, his eyes widening at the sight of the girl and the bottle lying nearby. He didn't say a word, but took out his phone and snapped a few pictures before quickly disappearing, as if afraid of being seen. The policeman was still sitting in the car, watching what was happening. His smirk was visible even through the windshield. He got out of the car, shoved his hands in his pockets, and slowly approached, glancing at the camera. "You know," he began, his voice sounding like he was lecturing her, "even if someone saw it, no one cares. Nobody cares about people like you." He turned to the camera and, grinning, removed his cap as if greeting an unseen spectator. "It's just another day at work," he added, glancing at the girl. "You'd better get used to it." Those words were like a knife stabbed into her heart. She felt the atmosphere of injustice squeezing her chest, rage boiling in her veins. Her eyes, filled with tears, stared at the camera. Somewhere out there, on the other side of the lens, someone saw her pain, her humiliation. But no one did anything about it. The only thing she could do was remember this moment forever. She swore to herself that he would not go unpunished. The policeman was about to return to the car, sure that everything had ended the way he wanted it to. The girl, motionless and seemingly broken, made no sound. But when he opened the car door, her voice, quiet but sharp, cut through the night silence. "You didn't even ask my name," she said in a shaky but somehow strangely confident tone. He froze. He turned his head slowly, as if he wasn't sure if he'd heard right. Her face was still tear-stained, but her eyes— there was no fear in those eyes anymore, just something that sent an unpleasant chill down his spine. "How so?" He smirked, trying to keep his mask of mockery, but his voice trembled slightly. She lifted her chin, her gaze digging into him like a blade. "Caroline Hunter," she said, each word sounding clear as a hammer blow. The name didn't elicit an immediate response from him, but something in the way she said it made him feel inexplicably anxious. He took a step closer, his arms crossed over his chest again. "So what? You think your last name means something?" His voice sounded rough, but there was tension in it. "You don't know who I am," she said with cold certainty. "But you will, soon enough, and then you'll regret everything you've done." The policeman laughed, but the laughter came out strained. "Threats?" he asked, coming even closer. "You're in no position to make threats." She didn't back away, didn't look away. Her tone remained the same. "It's not a threat. It's a promise." His heart sank for a moment, though he tried to convince himself that it was just the play of an intimidated girl. He was used to the fact that his words and actions always went without consequence. But at this moment, something in her confidence had pierced a crack in his armor of self-confidence. "Okay, we'll see," he said, less confidently, turned around and got in the car. He drove away, leaving the girl alone on the empty street. But even as the car disappeared around the corner, there was still an uneasiness inside him. He couldn't shake the feeling that this name, this warning, was more than just words. Caroline sat in her wheelchair, her hands still shaking, but a spark began to ignite in her chest. She knew this moment was a turning point. She knew she would never be a victim again. But most importantly, she knew she had the power to destroy men like him, her father. They hadn't spoken in a long time, and she had her own reasons for that. But now she realized it was time to return. Her father wasn't just a man with power. He was a man to be feared. His name could break the career of anyone who got in his way. And now she was going to turn to him. Caroline pulled out her cell phone. Her fingers slowly dialed a number she thought she would never dial again. The dial tones seemed endless until finally a deep voice came through. "Yes," he said, without any warmth in his tone. She swallowed hard, but her voice sounded firm. "It's me, Dad. We need to talk." There was a pause on the other end of the line, but then there was a short reply. "All right. I have time tomorrow morning." She knew it wouldn't be easy. Her father was a man who never interfered without a reason. But she had a reason. She knew that if he found out what had happened, he would make sure that this man would never dare do such a thing again. And while she had no idea yet exactly how that would happen, she was sure her name would soon be the beginning of the end for that policeman. The morning began for the policeman like any other. With his usual sense of superiority, he put on his uniform, tightened his belt, and put on his badge. His mind was still reeling from yesterday's incident. He saw nothing unusual in his actions. To him, it was just another night on the job. After checking his patrol car, he was about to go on duty when the call came from the station. His supervisor, Captain Miller, had asked him to come in urgently. The tone was dry, without further explanation. The policeman didn't pay much attention to it. He thought it was a routine meeting or another routine assignment. But something in the captain's voice still left a slight tinge of unease. 20 minutes later, he was already at the station. As he entered the building, he noticed an unusual tension in the air. Colleagues who usually greeted him with jokes or friendly nods suddenly looked away, avoided meeting his gaze. Some were even whispering behind his back. It was strange, but he put it down to the usual police intrigue. Captain Miller was waiting for him in his office. His face was serious and his fingers tapped rhythmically on the desk. When the policeman entered, the captain gestured to the chair in front of him. "Sit down, Jenkins," he said without raising his eyes. Jenkins sat down, noticing that there was a folder with his name on it on the desk. It made him a little wary. "Is something wrong?" he asked with a slight smile, trying to hide his growing anxiety. The captain looked up. There was something in his gaze that Jenkins hadn't seen before, a coldness mixed with judgment. "Do you know who Caroline Hunter is?" the captain asked, his voice sounding like a whiplash. The name made Jenkins tense. He remembered last night, her face, her voice, her warning, but he quickly pulled himself together. "Yeah, detained her last night," he said with a slight carelessness. "She was acting suspicious. Something wrong?" The captain laughed coldly, but there was not an ounce of mirth in that laugh. "Suspicious?" he asked, leaning back in his chair. "You have no idea who you're messing with." "So, who is she?" Jenkins tried to remain calm, but there was already a note of alarm in his voice. The captain opened the folder and pulled out a photograph of a man in a strict suit. His face was familiar to anyone who had ever turned on the television. "Her father is David Hunter," the captain said, tossing the photo in front of Jenkins. "State Attorney General." Jenkins' world crumbled. He stared at the photograph as if he hoped it was all a mistake. David Hunter's name was synonymous with power and ruthlessness. The man ruined the careers of people who tried to get in his way. And now Jenkins realized that he was in the way himself. "There's some mistake," he began, but the captain interrupted him. "A mistake?" Miller exploded. "You dared to humiliate his daughter. We have surveillance footage, eyewitness accounts, even photographs. Do you realize what you've done?" Jenkins felt cold sweat trickle down his back. He tried to say something, but the words stuck in his throat. The captain continued. "Hunter already knows everything. He's going to make it as public as possible. Do you realize what this means? You've jeopardized not only yourself, but our entire precinct." "Minus I didn't know," Jenkins muttered. "You had a duty to know," the captain shouted. "You're facing disciplinary proceedings, and I can't cover for you anymore." Captain Miller sighed, closing his eyes as if he wanted to disconnect from this nightmare for a moment. "You're free to go," he said at last. "Go home. Wait for the call." Jenkins rose slowly. His legs felt like cotton. He walked out of the office under the stares of his colleagues. No one said a word, but he could feel their contempt burning through him. Outside, he breathed deeply of the cold air, but it brought no relief. His thoughts swirled in a whirlwind. Everything that had seemed so solid was beginning to crumble like a house of cards. He knew there was a storm ahead of him, and that storm was already gathering strength. Let's pause for one more brief moment. Write in the comments where you're hearing our stories from and whether you've encountered something similar in your life. We're interested in hearing your thoughts. If you haven't subscribed yet, do so now so you don't miss the continuation of this story as we continue. The next day, the phone rang again at the station. Captain Miller, who was already preparing for a long and unpleasant day, picked up the receiver. When he heard who was on the other end, his face paled. "Of course, sir. We're expecting you," he said and hung up, slowly turning to the secretary. "Get the office ready, and tell Jenkins to be here in an hour." When Policeman Jenkins entered the station, he immediately sensed something wrong. The atmosphere was tense, as if before a storm. His colleagues didn't make eye contact with him, but as soon as he passed, he heard whispers behind him. He was called into the captain's office. Jenkins opened the door and froze. Miller wasn't the only one sitting at the desk. In one of the chairs sat a man he recognized immediately, David Hunter. His powerful figure, stern dark suit, and piercing eyes radiated strength and authority. This was a man accustomed to command. "Sit down," Miller said, pointing to a chair in front of the table. Jenkins sat up slowly, feeling cold sweat trickle down his back. Hunter kept his gaze on him. His eyes were like ice blades piercing through him. Jenkins tried to keep his balance, but he struggled under the pressure. "So, you're Officer Jenkins," Hunter began, his voice cold as steel. "The one who saw fit to abuse my daughter." Jenkins swallowed, his hands involuntarily clenched into fists. "Sir, it was a mistake." "Yeah." "A mistake?" Hunter interrupted, raising an eyebrow. His voice grew louder, his gaze even sharper. "It was a mistake to have you on the force, officer. It was a mistake to let men like you wear the uniform." "Sir," Jenkins tried to object, "I didn't know who she was." "You didn't know?" There was a sneer in Hunter's voice. "What a convenient excuse. So you think your behavior would have been acceptable if it hadn't been my daughter? Tell me, officer, how many other people have you humiliated under the guise of a badge?" Jenkins felt the heat flood his face. He tried to find the words, but they stuck in his throat. "Let me make it clear what's in store for you," Hunter continued, leaning back in his chair. "First, I'm going to make sure this case goes public. Everyone will know who you are. Second, you'll never wear a police uniform again. Not only will you lose your job, but you'll have a stain on your reputation that can't be erased." "Sir, this is too much," Jenkins began, but Hunter leaned forward sharply, his voice becoming a menacing whisper. "Too much?" he hissed. "What you did to my daughter was too much. Her humiliation, her pain, it was too much. Now you will experience what it means to be helpless. You will experience what she experienced that night." Miller was silent, as if afraid to interrupt the scene. He knew perfectly well that it was useless to try to contradict Hunter. The man always got his way. "I want you to understand one thing, officer," Hunter continued, standing up. His figure loomed over Jenkins, making him cringe in his wheelchair. "I'm not just going to ruin your career. I'll take everything from you. Your name, your reputation, your peace. You'll regret the day you decided to humiliate my daughter." Hunter paused, letting his words sink deep into Jenkins' mind. Then he leaned closer, his voice almost a whisper. "And then, I'll forget you exist." With those words, he straightened, glanced at Miller, and headed for the exit. His footsteps sounded like thunder in the silence, leaving a sense of inevitability behind them. When the door slammed shut, Jenkins remained seated, as if deprived of his strength. Hunter's words were all he could hear in his head. He understood. This was not just a man. This was a force that would wipe him out of his life like dust from the surface. The next day, Officer Jenkins awoke to the incessant ringing of his phone. Messages and missed calls poured in one after another. As soon as he looked at the screen, he knew something had gone wrong. News headlines and social media notifications filled his feed. Shocking video, police officer humiliates black girl in wheelchair, racism protected by a badge, a video that can't be ignored. His heart sank as he clicked on one of the videos. He appeared on the screen, roughing up a girl on a dark street. Everything, his words, his taunts, even the moment with the bottle, was captured on surveillance cameras and witnesses' phones. The video has already racked up millions of views and comments are boiling with anger. How is that even possible? He should be prosecuted for this. How dare he wear a uniform? Jenkins felt a wave of panic run through his body. He turned off the phone, but it seemed as if the world around him had already begun to crumble. The atmosphere at the station was tense. When he entered, colleagues who had once been friends with him now turned away or looked at him with contempt. Some of them made harsh remarks. "So, YouTube star, how's it going?" said one of the officers sarcastically. "You think you're going to get away with this?" threw another as he passed by. In his locker, someone left a printout of a frame from a video of him abusing a girl and wrote in red marker, "Shame on the police." Jenkins tried to ignore their stares and whispers, but the pressure was becoming unbearable. He stepped into Captain Miller's office, hoping for support, but was met with a cold stare. "Do you realize what you've done?" the captain asked, his voice cold and restrained. "This video is all over the news channels. The public is demanding your head. Protests have been organized outside the police building. Even the mayor has said that this is unacceptable." "Captain, Jenkins began, but Miller raised his hand, stopping him. "You think I can protect you after this? We've already got people demanding you be fired, and the next thing you know, there'll probably be charges." "But I didn't think that." Jenkins fell silent, realizing that his words sounded pathetic and unconvincing. "You weren't thinking at all," the captain shouted, slamming his fist on the table. "You've jeopardized not only yourself, but the whole station. Everyone looks at us now as collaborators of racism. Do you realize the hell you've put us through?" Jenkins walked out of the office, feeling as if the ground was slipping from under his feet. The protests outside the precinct could be heard even through the walls. Loud shouts, placards reading, "Justice for Carolyn," "Swing," "Stop Police Brutality." These sounds haunted him like hammer blows. On his way home in the evening, he noticed that his car was covered with leaflets with his name and picture. On the windshield, someone had spray-painted "Racist." A frightening silence greeted him inside the house. Neighbors who had previously nodded at him affably now avoided his gaze. Some even closed their windows when he passed by. He locked the door and turned on the TV, hoping to distract himself, but that proved to be a mistake. There was a talk show on the screen discussing his behavior. The guests, one by one, called him a symbol of police brutality. One of them said, "This is not an isolated incident. This is a systemic problem. But people like Jenkins need to set an example for the rest of us. They can't go unpunished." As if in confirmation, the screen showed protests where people chanted his name with hatred. Jenkins turned off the TV and sat on the couch, covering his face with his hands. He realized that things had gone too far. His world, built on the certainty of impunity, was crumbling by the hour. Now he wasn't just a policeman. He had become a symbol of everything society hated about the system, and that was just the beginning. The dismissal order came a week later. Policeman Jenkins sat in Captain Miller's office, clutching the official notice in his hands. His hands were shaking, but he tried to keep a straight face. Miller, standing across from him, did not say a word. His gaze was a mixture of anger and disappointment. "Get your things out of your locker," Miller said dryly, "and get out. You don't belong here anymore." "Captain, that's unfair." Jenkins tried to object, but his voice was weak. "I've given 10 years to this station." "Justice?" Miller laughed, but there was no joy in his laughter. "You're talking about justice after what you did? You've made us all look worse. Get your stuff and don't come back here again." Jenkins stood up slowly. His body felt heavy, like a mountain on his shoulders. He walked out of the office, feeling all the stares of his co-workers at his back. No one tried to stop him or offer support. He wasn't one of them anymore. He was greeted by shouts in the street. A crowd of protesters standing outside the police building spotted him. Someone shouted his name, and the next moment dozens of people were chanting, "Jenkins, racist, Zrenia, justice for Caroline." Placards with his face and the words "shame" went up in the air. He tried to leave, but protesters surrounded him. Someone threw a bottle at him. Someone spat in his direction. There was not just anger in people's eyes, but a hatred he had never seen before. "You will never wear a uniform again," shouted the woman closest to me. "You deserve every drop of this shame." He ran, trying to get away from the crowd, but her screams still haunted him. When he returned home, he found that his family had also turned their backs on him. His wife, who had always supported him before, now looked at him with contempt. "You did this," she said, her voice quiet but filled with anger. "You humiliated us. Now our children are afraid to leave the house. You ruined everything." "I didn't think it would go this far," he began, but she interrupted him. "You weren't thinking at all. I can't live with you anymore. We're leaving." He watched as she packed her things, as the children, whom he had always considered his pride, looked at him with horror, as if he were a stranger. He tried to explain, but no one listened. Hours later, he was alone in an empty house. It's been a few weeks. Jenkins' life became a living hell. His face was on every screen, his name a symbol of shame. People recognized him on the streets, pointed fingers, threw angry words. He lost his job, his family, his friends. No one wanted to do business with him. Every night he fell asleep with the feeling that the wall around him was getting higher and higher. He had nightmares in which he relived the incident over and over again. Only now he saw himself in Caroline's shoes. He felt the same helplessness she had felt that night. He felt like he was suffocating under the weight of his own guilt. One evening, while out shopping for groceries, he was again confronted by a crowd of protesters. Their shouts were directed only at him. Someone threw a bag of garbage at him. He ran, trying to hide in an alley, but even there he felt the stares. People were watching him, even if they didn't say anything. Hate was everywhere. In the loneliness of his empty house, he began to drink, trying to drown out his guilt and fear. But the alcohol only increased his despair. He no longer felt human. Everything he had seemed to have slipped through his fingers. Now he understood what it meant to be helpless, what it meant to feel outcast, unwanted, insignificant. This was the reckoning that had come upon him for everything. But the worst was ahead. He knew that society would never forget his name, and that this shame would stay with him forever. It's been months since Jenkins' video went viral. Society has turned its attention to new scandals. But for those involved in this tragedy, time seems to have stood still. Caroline Hunter, despite the public support, felt an inner emptiness. Every time she went out, she met people who admired her bravery, offered help, or just smiled, but it didn't bring relief. She saw herself in the mirror, and each time she went back to that night. The humiliation that left scars invisible to others, but deeply embedded in her mind. Her father, David Hunter, kept his promise. He had ruined Jenkins' career, but it didn't bring him satisfaction. Every victory in court, every comment in his support, only made him feel more guilty that he hadn't been able to protect his daughter sooner. He felt like he had failed her. He could punish Jenkins, but he couldn't erase the pain Caroline had endured. Jenkins, meanwhile, had hit rock bottom. After being laid off and his family leaving, he tried to find work, but his name was a black spot on any application form. His financial situation was rapidly deteriorating, and one day he found himself on the verge of eviction. The rent bills piled up, and soon he was forced to leave the house. He was now living in an old car parked on the outskirts of town. His face became an object of ridicule and anger. People recognizing him on the street often shouted insults or threatened him. Once his car was set on fire and he barely escaped. But the worst part was not the attack, but the apathy of those around him. No one came to his aid. He now knew what it was like to be rejected by society. One night, Jenkins sat in an abandoned parking lot with his arms wrapped around his head. His thoughts flitted between anger and despair. He blamed everyone around him, Caroline, her father, his co-workers, but increasingly he blamed himself. His world was shattered, and he knew he had nowhere else to go. At that point, he wrote a letter. In it, he didn't make excuses, but he asked for forgiveness. Not to Caroline, not to her father, but to himself. He apologized for becoming the man he hated. A passerby found his body the next morning. Jenkins had hanged himself from an old tree branch near the site where he had once worked. His letter was the last testimony of a man who, faced with the consequences of his actions, could not bear his own guilt. This news reached Carolyn and her father. It seemed that justice had been done, but there was no joy or relief in Caroline's soul. She could not rejoice in death, even if it was her abuser. Instead, she felt only heaviness. He deserved it, her father said, trying to protect her feelings. You don't have to think about it. But Caroline knew he was only partly right. His death couldn't bring her peace of mind back. She realized that the scars would remain forever, both her and her father's. This story ended in tragedy for everyone. Jenkins received payback for his actions, but it also took a toll on those who fought for justice. Guilt, pain, and broken lives are all that remain from this conflict. Everyone drew a conclusion for himself. But the main lesson, perhaps, was that injustice always leaves traces that do not disappear, even if it seems that the punishment has been carried out. We would like to know what you think of this story. How do you feel after it ends? Write in the comments what you think about what happened and how you feel about issues of justice, racism, and retribution. If you have experienced injustice or discrimination in your life, please tell us about it at DOT. Your stories are invaluable to us, and we read every comment carefully. We appreciate each of you sharing your time, emotions, and thoughts. You're not just viewers, you are part of our community, and we are grateful for your support. If you haven't subscribed to our channel yet, do so now to stay tuned for more stories. Give us a like if you liked our story and share it with your friends to discuss important topics together. We wish you a wonderful day, inspiration and strength to fight for justice in the world. Your voice is important.